Hello, everybody. My name is Bobby Battle, and for about the last 2 years, I've had the honor of serving along with Tom Farrell as the co-chair of the University of Virginia Bicentennial Commission. And now I'm going to go off script for a minute. Uh-oh, Bill. Get Stephanie to grab all the dog whistles. He's going off script again. What I wanted to do briefly was to frame this program in the context of the bicentennial because I think it fits so perfectly with it. It began under our first female president, Teresa Sullivan, and it's completed now with our next president, James Ryan, who gave a great speech, by the way, at WISE. And the Board of Visitors and the president gave us three major areas that we wanted to reflect upon. And this conference has hit all of them perfectly. The first was Commemoration of Our History. And it wasn't always a good history. In fact, a lot of it is kind of hard to come to terms with. And some of you may know, some of you may have seen the plaque up here that March 25th, 1963, I was 7 years old. I'm a native of Charlottesville. I was born and raised here. Thank you. How many of you are from Charlottesville? I'd just like to know. All right. Martin Luther King was invited to speak here, and Cabell Hall hadn't changed, so I'm guessing he stood right about here. And he was invited by an African-American student named Wesley Harris, who, like Melody Barnes, was from Richmond, from the Churchill neighborhood of Richmond. And he self-describes himself as an unnourished soul. I think that's probably a kind way of putting it. He was probably tormented on grounds, and he looked for some measure of reconciliation by bringing Dr. King here. And the administration wasn't ready to deal with that. In fact, nobody attended it from the leadership. Dr. King came alone. He stayed in the hotel on Emmett Street. It is now being reconstructed because it burned down. Remember, you guys that live here know that? Turns out in 1963, it had recently undergone fire damage, and he still stayed there anyway. There was only one restaurant on the corner he could eat at, the University Cafeteria. And Paul Gaston, yeah, you all know Paul? All right. He was a white professor here who was a civil rights leader. And the reason I'm telling this story because, I grew up a young white male of privilege in Charlottesville. But Paul and Wesley Harris and Dr. King walked up over Monroe Hill to get back to that hotel after the speech. And as they went down across McCormick Bridge, a really loud sound erupted, a bang. Wesley Harris and Dr. King immediately assumed it was an assassination attempt. So Wesley went to shield Dr. King. Dr. King went. Paul Gaston didn't react at all because he knew that it was just a car backfiring. So think about the difference. One is a life-threatening situation. The other one's completely benign. That was the gap in our town back then. And so not long after that, Dr. Gaston gave the first African-American studies class, and the president of the university and his wife were in the front row. So the great quote we all know, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Well, as we've learned here this week, there are a lot of forces that are trying to stop that bend. And what I think we need to do is work against that and turn that bend into a hairpin turn or a switchback that gets us to the top of the mountain a lot sooner. Thank you. Sorry to take up the time in this August panel, but the second one was engagement, and that's what we're doing here now. We're listening, we're teaching, we're learning, we're having really respectful conversations. And finally, the hardest part was figuring out and envisioning the future of public higher education. But in truth, it's been there all along. And it's not that we're yellow cab waking up to Uber on Monday morning going, who are they? And Google University has taken all of our students away with online classes. It's more about, we went to Padua to share an academic relationship with that 800-year-old university. And they had a woman graduate 341 years ago from the University of Padua. And the rector sat down with us, Mr. Rector sat down with us, and he said, Galileo Galilei, he came to Padua in the 16th century because it's the only place in Italy he can think freely. And the Roman Inquisition was making it really hard on scientists at that time. And I saw Rusty Connor, I looked at this rector and I said, Mr. Rector, that's how you address the rector, Mr. Rector. Hopefully Mrs. Rector sometimes too. In an original letter 2 years before the cornerstone was laid for this university, Thomas Jefferson wrote, to a group of private subscribers, philanthropists that were going to support this university. He said that we count self-governance as the greatest of our political blessings that cannot be maintained but by an intelligent and instructed people. So our roles as universities are to promote, preserve, and foment democracy through education. And President Ryan made this announcement about the Democracy Initiative, and we're just totally excited about that. And I think the Miller Center needs to be congratulated. All of you who have supported the Miller Center and the university, thank you. I think we have wings on this one, and I'm really excited. Now, back to script. An amazing group of people here. And one of the things as a bicentennial chair, I've gotten to know many of our university treasures. And Risa Goluboff is one of them over here, the dean of the law school, and an expert on civil rights. And in fact, President Sullivan asked Risa to help us out of the process of August 11th and 12th. And she helped us navigate. Those waters were tough, really tough. And by the time we had the launch celebration on that Friday in October, we could sort of feel the river of healing coming over us. And Risa, thank you for that. Next is Susan Rice, who served as National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the United Nations under President Barack Obama. Prior to that, she worked in the Clinton administration at both the White House and the State Department. She has a new book out that is called Tough Love, My Story of Things Worth Fighting For. This was actually cited in the Daily Progress yesterday, Susan. So it's a newsworthy publication. You should check it out. Finally, Peter Weiner, who works as the director of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives under George W. Bush. Actually, let me get this right. Bush 41 and then Bush 43. You guys have taught me how to say that. And Peter is a leading thinker, the Center for Ethics and Public Policy, and a regular contributor to Commentary, the National Review, as well as writing a monthly column for the New York Times. And you have a new book too, don't you, Peter? Sorry, I don't have that, but... What do we call it? Okay.
The death of politics.
Right.
You're hired. Thank you.
In case you didn't hear, it's called The Death of Politics. And finally, another institutional treasure, Melody Barnes, who is the co-director of the Democracy Initiative in the College of Arts and Sciences and a professor of practice at the Miller Center. And we are so excited that Melody is going to help lead the Democracy Initiative. And with that, I'll shut up and get off the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. And it is so absolutely wonderful to be here with you all this morning and this great panel. Risa was my boss when I taught in the law school. Susan was my colleague in the White House, and we've been friends for a very long time. And then Pete has become a wonderful friend who spoke at my class in the law school. So it's great to be here with you all. And I thought I would start out because Bobby's introduction ties so nicely with the theme for this panel. Everything that he spoke about goes to this issue, why democracy? And there are people who ask that question in different ways right now. There are people who say, why democracy? And there are those who say, why democracy? And we are here today to engage around those issues. And I would like to start with you, Risa, because you are not only a wonderful constitutional law scholar, but you are also an historian. And as you know, at this point, we use the term democracy very liberally. I mean, in our common conversation, we talk about America as a democracy, challenges to democracy. We use it liberally, when in fact, it isn't quite accurate with regard to our country and the structure of our country. And I was wondering if you could start us off by talking about democracy and what that means here in the United States.
Sure. So democracy has many meanings, right? The demos, the people, it's ruled by the people at its most basic idea. And our Constitution, the innovation of our Constitution, I always tell my constitutional law students, is that the people were sovereign, right? The idea of who is sovereign, it's the people. But it's not quite the people. Mm-hmm. Our Constitution sets up a structure of governance that is representative democracy. It's not direct democracy. And you can think of a number of different examples, the Electoral College, the fact that originally the Senate wasn't elected by the people, it was elected by state legislatures. There are all kinds of ways in which our democracy both promotes the power of the people and the power of popular politics and also constrains it. And that's built into the Constitution. And you can think about the court as a check on democracy, the counter-majoritarian nature of the court, and you can think about the checks and balances of the different branches. Whenever I say this, I think about, fifth grade civics, right? The executive, legislative, and judicial branches, right? They're opposing each other in various ways, and that was meant to be a way of checking the power of the people directly. So there are all these checks in there, and I think the Constitution itself creates not only a structure of governance that creates representative democracy, but it also creates the vocabulary with which we then debate and argue over what our governance will actually do substantively, right? So it's not only a document that structures our democracy, but it creates aspirations for our democracy, aspirations of free and equal citizenship, the kinds of issues that Bobby was talking about. And we've always struggled as a nation from the very beginning. We've had democracy and we've had slavery, and we've had liberalism and we've had illiberalism. And so, when you think about how does democracy operate, it operates in the context of a document that structures the rules of the field and also creates aspirations about who we want to be as a people that we sometimes achieve and sometimes don't, and we always achieve in conversation with that document through politics and social movements and social change, trying, I think, to expand the demos, right, and create greater ability for participation and equality, but we don't always succeed, and it doesn't move linearly, right? We move forward and we move backward.
And how would you say the fact that we are a constitutional republic and everything that you described has shaped the way that our country looks today, the way that citizens engage and non-citizens engage in political life, are a part of the body politic today?
Oh, I think it structures everything. I mean, I think, as I said, it both structures, you think about, this is the most mundane thing, but the State of the Union, that's in the Constitution, right? The way we think about who we are in the most fundamental terms is constitutional to our political being. And if you look over the long sweep of history, you can tell a very nice progressive story, right? A Whiggish story that we just get more and more democratic, right? So there's slavery, and then we get emancipation, and then we get enfranchisement, right? You can tell a similar story about women who don't have civil or political rights and then do, right? You can go through a number of groups, and yet you see the historian in me, right? That's often the story we like to tell as a matter of kind of constitutional expansion. But the historian in me knows, but you have a civil war, right? And you have the efforts to protect slavery, and you have secession, and democracy is pretty fragile, actually. And then you have Jim Crow, and you have disenfranchisement before you get additional enfranchisement, and now you have efforts to disenfranchise again. So I think what we see today is the result of an accumulated dynamic of social movements, political power, constitutional doctrine that all kind of cycle within one another, and I think there's no inevitability. It's very contingent. There's no linearity to it. I think we like to think there's an overall sweep. I think there is probably an overall sweep, but at any given moment, I think you have to have institutions in civil society and not just the government who are committed to the constitutional norms as well as the constitutional laws of equal and free citizenship.
Great. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. And thank you for starting to provide a foundation for us. But I want to expand beyond the United States, obviously. I think many of us living in America think about America, we think about, first democracy, largest democracy, most important democracy, but we weren't the first, and we're not the largest. The rest of the world, India being the largest democracy in the world. So Susan, I'd like for you to expand the frame for us so we can think about democracy globally. And literally, what does democracy look like around the world, in other parts of the world?
Well, thank you, Mel. But before we do that, I just want to say, don't we all want to take constitutional law with Risa?
From Risa?
I really do.
You're welcome anytime.
Thank you.
I hear she's a tough grader,
I don't know if I can get into law school, but I'd love to take your class. I'd say that the state of democracy globally is, to be charitable, anemic. And, you know, it's interesting, when you look back over 10, 20, 30 years, go back, say, to the 1990s and the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the aftermath of that, and it felt like democracy was on the march. I was then working on Africa, and just to give you one example of a continent, you know, in 1990 there were roughly 5 democracies in Africa. By the end of the decade, there were roughly 25. And that sort of progress we were seeing not only in Africa, but in many parts of the world, Latin America eventually. You know, we saw the expansion of NATO and the broadening of the EU, all under the rubric of countries who shared values and systems that were broadly democratic. And now what we see is at least a stagnation in terms of the actual number of democracies, but more worryingly, the character and the caliber of democracy where it exists. And so, you know, we're now increasingly seeing elected authoritarians in Hungary, in Turkey, in various places around the world, and arguably, potentially in the United States as well. We also have the problem of the United States, having been the world's oldest and most prominent democracy. We are now exhibiting to the rest of the world the weaknesses and the failures of democracy, and the ability of our system to yield tendencies that are authoritarian, when, you know, the leadership of the country is not telling the truth, when there is a blatant willingness to ignore the authority of Congress and fail to respond to subpoenas, calling into question the basic balance of power, when there's an assertion that the press is the enemy of the people. These are all things that undermine the fabric of our democracy, and we are broadcasting that to the world, and I think giving credence and impetus to anti-democratic instincts, even within democratic societies. Then you have what's just happened in India, which is, of course, the world's largest democracy, and you know, there the mechanics of the election look good. I think you can say that in many places. The mechanics seem solid, but the outcome may be the start of something that we haven't necessarily seen before, which is a sectarian democracy. And the consequences of that are yet to be seen, but could be quite dramatic and concerning. Meanwhile, China, with its model and its effort to bring under its umbrella, particularly developing countries that are fragile and poor, that may have autocratic instincts, to sort of strengthen its universe of nation-state acolytes that subscribe to more authoritarian models. That China's efforts are gaining traction, and we are creating, I'm afraid, a vacuum on the side of those who believe in universal values and the utility and strength of democracy. So it's an interesting and I'd say worrying moment. Mm-hmm. Over the long term, however, I'm an optimist for a very simple reason, which is that the values that we're talking about and that we care about are fundamentally universal. I don't know of a human being from any country, any culture, any religion, any race that wants the boot of a government on its neck. We all want to be able to say what we believe, associate with the people we want to associate with, worship as we want, love who we want, and we don't want the state or any other institution telling us that we can't. And that fundamental human yearning to be ourselves and to be able to express ourselves and to live in some fundamental freedom, I think it will out over time.
And picking up on that for just a minute or two more, you talk about those fundamental desires that people have around the world, and you unlike probably most of us in this room, have been in places where democracy was new and democracies were being established. How do you do that? I mean, how do you go about helping to set up or stand up democracy as new countries are being formed or as countries have overthrown old ways and are beginning to build democracy fresh? And should we expect democracy to look the same in different places? I mean, we have a lens here in the United States, but should we export that to or expect it to be exported to other parts of the world?
Well, your last question is particularly important. I think, no, we cannot expect it to be the same everywhere. In fact, our system, as Risa described, is completely unique and in its structure, in its nature. And I think we need to be very humble. The notion that we can export democracy, whether through the barrel of a gun or through the force of our policies, I think needs to be revisited. I think our best ability to spread democracy and see it thrive is through us in the United States demonstrating its effectiveness and success, setting a powerful example and encouraging others with like values and institutions to do the same. But I think if we've learned anything over the last 20, 25 years, it's when democracy is imposed from the outside or is not taken root on an indigenous basis. It's fragile and may not be sustainable. Yeah, but because of the fundamental human yearning that I described, that I think human beings everywhere share, when it comes from within, when there's a genuine desire among civil society and the population to have leaders that are accountable, that are not corrupt, that are serving the interests of the people, I think there you have great fertile ground for democracy. And I think that's ultimately what, as I said earlier, what most people, if not everybody, wants. So how they get there with what traditions, what norms, what form that democracy takes, I think we are going to have to be more open-minded and flexible in that than we perhaps have been in the past. And yet, what we need to insist on are universal values, that we are all created equal, that we all have the right, as I said, to speak our minds and to be with who we want to be with, and to try to influence the outcome of our governing system.
I want to bring you into the conversation, Pete, and pick up on a word that Susan used, which is fragility. And Risa also talked about this a bit when she talked about the long sweep of American history and American democracy because of the challenges that we are looking at today. And I think for so many of us in this room, and probably why so many of you have been here for the past 2 days, is because people are deeply concerned about those challenges. And I would go beyond deeply concerned to say there's a real fear about the fragility of democracy, and something that people didn't necessarily expect to see here in the States and are certainly concerned about what it looks like globally. And I wonder if you could talk some about some of the challenges that you see. And they're root cause challenges, and then there are challenges and concerns that are symptomatic, but at the same time still quite serious.
Sure, happy to do it. Thanks for having me. And I think I want to sit in on the classes all of you teach, actually, and take good notes throughout. Yeah, in terms of the first thing I'd say is it's actually good in my view that there is concern and worry. There should be, but the worst thing is apathy. The worst thing is if you begin to lose things that you treasure and you don't care about that or you don't do anything about it. So I think there are reasons to be alarmed, but I'm glad that people are alarmed because that can ultimately give way to civic action. And in terms of when I think about what are the main challenges to democracy at home, I'd say there's several things. At the top of my list, I guess I would put not just what I see right now as an assault on truth, but an effort to annihilate truth. Truth is a concept. Truth and falsity is concepts. And I think that's being led by the president. I won't get to be too partisan about it, but it'd be an affectation to pretend that he doesn't exist or that what's going on isn't being driven by him. I say that as a lifelong Republican. But I think this idea of that you annihilate the concepts of truth, that it's corroded and eroded, is very, very dangerous ground. It's different than what we've had before. We've had presidents and politicians and people who shade the truth and who tell lies. But the idea that the categories of truth, demonstrable truth, don't exist, it's just something we haven't really seen before. It's a kind of a epistemological anarchy. And if you have epistemological anarchy over time, that eventually leads to flat-out anarchy, because you don't have anything objective to base politics on, or ultimately even human life. I think it was in 2016 that the Oxford Dictionary said that post-truth was the word of the year, and it may become definitional.
Which also seems to suggest, in a sad and deeply concerning way, how normal that is becoming. And I use obviously normal in quotation marks, that's something to be expected.
Right, it's exactly right. It's this notion that my truth is my truth, and your truth is your truth. There's no way to arbitrate it, and ultimately it's a kind of Nietzschean will to power. That whoever has the power gets to write the script and write the story. And one of the reasons I think this is such a big deal is because the Enlightenment project was based on the notion that you would separate facts, the acceptance of facts, from the application of facts. So we would agree on a set of facts, a set of realities, and then we would have debates about how you pursue justice. But there are people, Karl Mannheim and other social theorists, who said, no, that won't happen. Because eventually what we'll do is you will conflate them, and you can't separate facts from your own ideological precepts, and that whole thing collapses. And if that happens, then the Enlightenment project dissolves. So that, I think, is really high on my list of concerns. The second thing, it's not just the partisanship and polarization, and we know from the social science research that we're living in the most polarized time in modern times. These are trends that predate the current president. If you go back, every president was, Clinton was more polarizing than George H.W. Bush. George W. Bush was more polarizing than Clinton. Barack Obama was more polarizing than George W. Bush, and Trump is more polarizing. So there are sort of deep currents that have been leading to polarization. But now we've entered into what other social scientists refer to as a kind of political tribalism. And that is this notion that you are simply part of a team. And it is your team no matter what. It doesn't matter what the facts are. And you don't have political opponents. You have political enemies. You view the people who disagree with you as enemies of the state. And then what you do in the world of politics is you create your own silo, where all that you hear is facts and analysis to confirm what you already believe. And now, because of social media and other things, we're able to do that in ways that we've never done before. And we really have to try, and I'm speaking for myself as well, try to listen, not just listen to respond to people who disagree with, but listen well, to try and listen to their perspective, to think, is there something that I need to hear about their experience or their point of view that I might have been blind to, and to try not to depersonalize the people who disagree with you. Because if you don't have that, you don't have really a country anymore. You just begin to break up into these separate categories. And at least in my life in politics, and I've been involved in politics my entire life, both serving in government and in the world of commenting on it, this is as bad as I can remember. It's not as if we haven't had polarized times in the past. We had Civil War, and we've had some, late 1960s, so there have been some very difficult times before. But at least in my life in politics, I've never really experienced this. And the heatedness of politics and the personalization of it is spreading. And then the last thing I'd say is a spreading isolationism and alienation and loneliness in the people. We see that from social science research. We see that suicide rates among young people, which is skyrocketing. The social media age seems to have amplified that. If you go back and read what was promised by the social media age, at the dawning of the social media age, it was supposed to bring us together and connect people. In fact, that's not happened, and people are more and more living lives of isolation and lack of connectedness. And that creates all sorts of pathologies. It creates just in individual lives difficulties. Communities are broken apart. And those kind of personal pathologies eventually make their way into political pathologies and more broadly social pathologies. There are really impressive efforts. David Brooks, a close friend of mine, is heading up a project at the Aspen Institute, the WEAVE initiative, which is going around the country finding people who are essentially reweaving the social fabric and trying to deal with these areas of isolation and loneliness. But this is something that's I think is a real threat as well.
Yeah, and you talk about the isolation and loneliness, and certainly over time, people have probably read Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone. Danielle Allen, a political theorist, writes about this, and the need to create bridging ties, that those who are different from one another in various ways, still coming together and working across that cleavage to find common cause for the good civic health, for the good of the country, and then ultimately how those bridging ties can start to form bonding ties and ways that we can reconnect with one another.
I'll tell one quick story just on that. It's apropos of some of what I said. C.S. Lewis, in his book Surprised by Joy, told a story about what he referred to as first and second friends. And the first friends is the people who are your alter ego. Those are the people where if you begin a sentence, those people can complete it. For him, it was a fellow named Arthur Greaves, who he had known throughout his childhood. He said the second friends is the anti-self. It's the person that reads all the same books that you do and draws all the wrong conclusions from them.
But you thought, what?
And exactly. And he described his second friend as a person named Owen Barfield, who was a contemporary of Lewis, was actually in this group called the Inklings. They had these very intense public debates on very esoteric issues about the role of imagination and reasoning in human life. But Lewis, in Surprised by Joy, says, Owen and I, we used to argue. He said we would argue, go at it, hammer and tong, late into the night, arguing with each other on all sorts of issues. The thing that was so interesting to me in reading that account is they both treasured their friendship precisely because they saw things in a somewhat different way. And Owen Barfield said, whenever Lewis and I debated, it wasn't for victory, it was for truth. And the idea was that we can't individually, no matter how wise you are, we can never see the truth fully for what it is. That's why we need each other. And so we need people who come in and bring different perspectives and help us to see things that we would otherwise be blind to. It's a mistake in politics to think what we need is people have to give up their differences. That's never going to happen, and it probably shouldn't happen. What we have to do, and what we're not doing so well now, is to navigate those differences, is to say, okay, we have a different view, but we've got to work within the structures of government and with the certain habits of democracy that not only allow us to live together, but actually to flourish by learning from one another.
And that goes to your point, I think, the shift from we're political opponents. And I remember seeing this when I first went to Congress. The fights were furious. But at the same time, there were ways that people started to come together. But when you move to a place where your opponent becomes your enemy, when they become dehumanized, then it is almost impossible to come back together. Risa and Susan, I'm wondering, Pete mentioned some of the challenges that he sees. What else would you all add to that list of challenges that democracy is facing both at home and abroad?
That was enough.
That's your downer for the day.
I was thinking, I too am an optimist.
Why were you optimistic again? Remind me we need that now.
It's hard to remain.
Yeah, pull the covers over heads in the morning.
No, seriously, I mean, first of all, I agree 100% with everything you said, and the way you're thinking about the challenge we face domestically is very much the way I'm thinking about it. And I'm also thinking about, what do we do about it? And there really are no silver bullets, and I think we need a lot more thinking collectively about what we do about it. But I would point to a couple of things potentially. One, very obvious but neglected, is civics education. We don't teach our kids about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the fundamentals that undergird our democratic society. They don't know. When they come to university, I don't know if this is the case at Virginia, but I think in many universities, very, very prominent universities, there is a reticence to engage difficult issues, and there is a discomfort with debate that may make people feel offended.
Right.
And I have my political views. They're relatively progressive, although I'm less certain of that as time goes on. I'm starting to think I've become an old school conservative in my age. But I worry that students in some places walk into classrooms, and when the debate may veer into areas that may offend you because you've perhaps experienced physical assault, or because it's painful to discuss an aspect of race or sexual orientation, whatever the issue may be, that a professor may give students a warning. This may offend you. If you don't want to hear this discussion, now you might leave. Or when you have groups of very liberals or very conservatives on campus whose views are in opposition to the mainstream, they're feeling under siege. And this is not healthy. If we can't, in a university setting, engage these debates and have these difficult discussions, then I don't know where we can do them. So I think civic education from the very beginning of what we teach our kids in school, universally, to insisting that these difficult issues be discussed and debated openly and rationally on the basis of fact in our institutions of higher learning is one thing. I think there's a whole nother thing about social media, which, Peter, you also touched on, and the fact that we only consume the information that's comfortable to us, that we can completely self-select what we know. I mean, many of us in this room are old enough to remember when the news came to us, by 3 white men on 3 networks every night who told us the facts. And we all shared the same fact base for the most part. And that was hugely helpful, because without that, as Peter said, we're literally talking past each other. So now in an era where information is proliferating and opinions are hard to distinguish from fact, and the President of the United States is, denigrating mainstream media, how do we get back to an era where we are effective consumers of information? So I think we also have to teach our kids and ourselves as adults how to question the information we receive, how to do thoughtful analysis about what is in fact fact and fiction, and how do we figure out means of compelling ourselves to reach outside of our bubbles and hear what other people are hearing, and understand that whether it's actually fact or opinion, it's relevant because half our population is consuming it.
Yeah.
The last thing I'd say, and this is arguably a radical thought, but when I think about—
You heard it here first.
when I think about how we much more fundamentally heal this domestic divide and this political polarization, which I think is literally the greatest threat to our national security, and I can elaborate why I say that, but I really do, more than any foreign adversary. I think we need to consider mandatory national service for everybody 18 to 21 in this country should serve at least a year doing something, whether it's in the military, whether it's in the Peace Corps, whether it's in an AmeriCorps, whether it's a new WPA. I don't really care. The point is that that is the only way I can think of that will compel Americans from very different backgrounds to have to know each other and work together, much the way the military does. And when you know each other as human beings, it's a lot easier to listen, and it's a lot harder to hate and demonize. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 60s and 70s. D.C. But I grew up in an environment, well, first of all, full disclosure, I grew up in a very privileged environment where I went to private schools, and schools where my classmates were the sons and daughters of members of Congress and ambassadors and members of the administration. I grew up with kids that were Republicans and Democrats. And that was a time when, before cable television and before social media, when members of Congress moved to Washington and lived in Washington with their families and knew each other as human beings. Their spouses hung out, their kids were friends. This was regardless of party. And so people knew each other as human beings, which made the sort of compromise melody that was still possible in the time you worked for Senator Kennedy alive. Now we don't do that, and we don't know each other as human beings, and we need to find ways to restore that basic understanding that whether you come from rural Nebraska or Brooklyn, that we have more in common than we have that separates us. And that we're in this together, we're in this boat whether we like it or not as a nation together. And if we don't accept that, if we allow ourselves to be divided internally, then we're hanging up our cleats as a democracy, and we're hanging up our global leadership, and we're just succumbing to perpetual division and I would argue ultimately disintegration. And I don't think that we can afford to go there, and I think we need to be looking at radical ways to try to avert that dynamic.
Well, Risa, I want to... And I'm sure you can get more if you buy the book, buy both of their books. Risa, I want to ask you a question because this is PresFest, so the Presidential Ideas Festival. We're looking at democracy through the lens of the presidency. And the president domestically obviously looms large, and also looms large on the international stage as well. But at the beginning, the idea wasn't that the president was central to this experiment, to this project. I mean, we don't even meet the presidency until we get all the way through Article 1. So there's Article 2, and then we sit here at UVA, university founded by Thomas Jefferson, third president, and if you go to his tombstone, how many people here know what is on Jefferson's grave marker?
Wow.
Right. So...
Which is, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, not President of the United States.
Exactly.
Not mentioned.
Exactly. He skipped over that, and people have different theories of that, but one of them was he likes big ideas and the things he cared about, UVA, religious freedom, the Declaration of Independence. But given all of that, how has the presidency shaped our democracy, and the shift in presidential power shaped democracy and power in democracy?
So I would start a step back, actually, and say that, that it's not just the presidency that has become more prominent in our democracy, but the federal government overall, right? So when you look at the original Constitution, the fear of tyranny is really a fear of tyranny of the federal government, and it's thought that the states will be the bulwarks of liberty, and the Bill of Rights, for example, only restrains the federal government at the founding. And so a lot of what was in the Constitution was meant to constrain the power of the federal government in order to allow liberty and freedom to flourish. And I think that, and so then within that, as you say, Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislature and Congress, and it's very long and very detailed, and they are obviously thinking a lot about what the legislature will look like. They think the legislature will be the central governing body and also will be potentially the most dangerous to democratic freedom. And the president is second, the courts are third. They're the least dangerous branch, the least powerful branch. But over time, going back to the Civil War, right, during the Civil War and after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments that end slavery and announce that there should be the franchise for freed former slaves, and that create equal protection of the laws and due process of the laws. Those are all meant to constrain the states. So suddenly there's this realization, wow, the states, they really can behave badly. It's not just the federal government. So I think there's a shift in the federal balance there. And then at the turn of the 20th century with the progressive era, there's a new rise in federal power generally. And then over the course, especially of the 20th century, I think you see an incredible expansion of the role of the presidency. Some of that is in foreign affairs. It's the role of the United States in the world and the president as the mouthpiece and the central repository for American foreign affairs power. But part of that is President Roosevelt, the 1930s, World War II, the extension of the federal government and especially the executive and the creation of a huge federal bureaucracy, often called the fourth branch, right, the administrative powers.
But there's nothing like a good executive branch staff person.
Perfect. Absolutely. Wonderful. Look at these three specimens, right? But I think there's, so the rise, I think you have to think about the rise of presidential power in the context of both the rise of federal power and the rise of executive branch power. And then within those two things nested is the rise of presidential power and the rise of the power of the individual president. But one thing I would say about that, and this goes also in response to the conversations we've been having, is, you know, there's always a relationship between the laws on the books, the Constitution as a parchment barrier. We like to think we're a government of laws, not of men, and yet, or women, but the historical statement is men. But I think that one of the things you see is you can't actually disaggregate the people and the customs from the rules. And that we are, I think, far more dependent on the people and Republican values, little r Republican values, the idea that we have public virtue and that we act on that public virtue, and the customs that constrain the laws. And I think many of us would have thought that the law and the Constitution did a lot more work to constrain what people do, and I think it's clear that what people do, and by that I mean not only our leaders, but all of us, right. And the way we interact with the media, the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with political parties, what we expect from our leaders, right? There's a dynamic relationship there between what leaders do and what their constituents want them to do. It's not a one-to-one correlation. There's not perfect agency, but I do think that there are expectations that go in both directions. And the last thing I'll say, and I know I've moved far from the original question, but I think it's related, because I think it's easy for us to look outward and say, I see bad actors, and not also look inward and say, what are my actions and how can I help? And Justice Breyer came to the law school last year, and when someone asked this question about how can we listen to each other, how can we talk to each other, his response was, well, the first thing you do is you look in the mirror and you ask what kind of listener you are and what kind of speaker you are, and that alongside these are our political enemies, not our political opposition, comes they're bad and I'm good. And in order to get past that, I think we have to ask not only, you know, what makes them bad, but am I really perfect? And where am I getting my news sources? And how am I talking and listening to people? And am I doing so with respect and empathy and trying to understand where other people are coming from?
Which is, you mentioned public virtue. I mean, that's central to this idea of civic health and civic virtue, which is fundamental to a democracy, to a constitutional republic. And curious now, we'll go to questions from the audience after this question, but we've talked about some of the challenges. We've touched a little bit on the how to move forward, but we've talked about some of the challenges. We've talked about the various actors, people the presidency, touched on Congress. I'm curious, and I'm sure the audience is as well, given the things that are ahead of us, given the steep hill that we look at both domestically and globally, how do we go about strengthening, and in some cases, imagining and fulfilling the aspirations of democracy where they haven't existed before? How do we go about doing that given the tools that we have and the challenges that we see? Pete, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'd say a couple of things. First thing is, particularly since I was the main downer in the group, let me see if I can climb up.
This is really an intervention to me.
Exactly. Let me climb up a few rungs from this hole I've dug on the ladder. I do think it's important to say several things. The first thing is that in these conversations about where we are and the challenges we face, we've got to keep perspective, including historical perspective. We really have been in periods much worse than this. As I said earlier, there was the Civil War, the late 1960s.
Absolutely.
There were 5 domestic bombings a day in a period in the early 70s. There were riots in the streets, the Vietnam War, and so forth. History has its cycles. This country has had huge challenges in the past and huge stains and huge sins that we've had to overcome. But by and large, we've overcome them. So fatalism is the worst thing to bear in mind, and the American capacity for self-renewal is extremely important and impressive.
And John Meacham writes about this as well.
Exactly.
If you look back over history, you see us time and time again taking steps forward. Doesn't mean the challenges aren't there, but taking steps forward.
And if you look at where America is now versus where we were 50 years, 150 years ago, I mean, we've made tremendous strides. And I would also say that not to downplay the capacity for people to change minds. I'll just mention 2 movements. And here, just bracket whatever you think about same-sex marriage. I mean, if you went back in the early 1990s, the idea that you would have same-sex marriage as the law of the land and as widely accepted as it is, you would never have believed it. And there were really, in my mind, 2 principal people that changed were fundamental to changing the mind of the country. That's Jonathan Rauch and Andrew Sullivan. And they were making these arguments when it was not fashionable for same-sex marriage. Basically what they did is they said the gay rights movement, which in the past had been viewed as a transgressive movement, as an assault on the family. And they said, no, actually we want to be a part of the family. We just want to expand the circle. And I know both of them, they're both friends of mine. And if you read what they said at that time, and it's a very contentious debate, they were very civil and very methodical, and they just made their case. And over time, it won. And the other one is, I'd say, the Metoo movement, which I think is one of the best social movements of the last 50 or 100 years. That thing happened in almost the blink of an eye. It was sort of one event that kind of precipitated it, but we have now fundamentally changed our attitudes. So attitudes can change, and the other thing is that sometimes in the life of an individual and in the life of a country, certain virtues, certain attributes that you take for granted when they're stripped from you, you're reminded why you cared about them in the first place. And you begin to say, these are things that I'm going to fight for and defend. And viruses create their own antibodies. And I think that where I am genuinely hopeful about this is that this notion of seeing these problems and seeing what is happening in the country, that there are people that are deeply troubled by it and that they will stand up. You know, Wordsworth, and I guess it's the Prelude, has this lovely line where it says, what we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how. And part of that is what it is to be a citizen, which is to love what is worth loving and to teach other people why they should love it. And the last thing I'll say is there's a wonderful speech. It's my favorite Bobby Kennedy speech, and I have a lot of them. But it's the one he gave in South Africa in 1966. It's known as his Ripples of Hope speech. It's actually carved next to his gravesite in Arlington. And so he went to South Africa in the midst of apartheid. It was a really big deal because he was a senator at the time and he was a Kennedy. and really no major Western political figure had been in South Africa at the time. And he gave a speech, and he talked about the danger of the futility, when young people in particular believe that things can't change. And he made the point, he said, every time an individual stands for justice, stands for ideals, stands for the lot of others, it creates a ripple of hope. And those ripples over time become a current, and those currents have the power to blow apart the walls of oppression. Now, he was in South Africa at the height of apartheid, and they ended up getting rid of apartheid. We're not in that situation now. And so our challenges are significant, but we have the capacity. We're not corks in an ocean. We're not powerless. That's what democracy is. And so a lot of this is in our individual lives, your life as a person in a family, in a community, in a Bible study, in a book club, in a bowling league, whatever you are. And then as a citizen involved in politics, which is to fight for what you care about, and to treat other people with some degree of civility throughout that process. And things can go south quicker often than we think, but they can also get better quicker than we think. And you can be a theoretical pessimist, but you should be an operational optimist.
I'm going to go to audience Q&A unless our two theoretical and operational optimists have anything they want to add.
No, that's fine.
So why don't we take some questions from the audience?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here this morning. Our first question is, as the Electoral College comes under greater scrutiny, there are movements to give more weight to the popular vote. Do you see the institution as beneficial to our democracy?
College?
The electoral,
Yeah.
You said the Electoral College? The Electoral College.
I'll define. Rita, you
Risa.
want to take it?
You're our Supreme Court clerk.
Happy to defer.
You're the constitutional expert.
Well, the original intent behind the Electoral College, it has its challenges as well, but has it served us well in certain points? I know people look at it more recently as the Electoral College versus the popular vote, which is in many ways one of the reasons that the founders put it there from the beginning. This was an initial distrust of the people and wanting to send thoughtful people, electors, people who would break away from the public and make a reasoned decision, which no one is breaking away from the public. But
Right, no, so I think it was one of the counter-majoritarian checks from the beginning in the Constitution, right? Exactly as you say. It was meant to be a way of putting a brake on popular democracy when some elite group of electors, thought that was necessary, and in particular in the context of constitutional compromise. At the time, it was very embedded in the slavery debates, and it was embedded in fears of the southern states that they would lose political power. So, though I think it may have played different roles over the course of time, I don't think looking at its origins actually gives all that much succor to the Electoral College being a positive institution. I don't know whether I'm not a student enough of the Electoral College to know whether there are moments over time that we might point to and say, that was a good thing. But the moment when it comes up is when it is in conflict with the popular vote, and I think most people today think that's problematic rather than a good thing. And when we're talking, and I was thinking about this as you spoke earlier, Susan, about the illiberal democracies that we see around the world, we often think the more democracy, the better. The more public input, the better. But democracy can become populism and demagoguery and tyranny, and that's certainly what the framers had in mind when they thought about the Electoral College. I think today we definitely see it as a check in a negative way. That's not to say one couldn't imagine it as a check in a positive way, but it's kind of hard to do, and I think looking historically doesn't help all that much.
Right. Why don't we take another question?
Democracies throughout the world can seem endangered nowadays. Meanwhile, orders of government upheld by nations like China or Russia seem stable. How can we restore a global faith in democracy when democracy as a government form seems fragile and volatile by comparison?
Well, that's similar to what we were talking about earlier. I will say this, I'm not nearly as confident as the question would imply that Russia and China are stable systems. They are strong-arm authoritarian systems that keep their population under a hugely high degree of repression. And China in particular is becoming more repressive. Russia is a one-man show. And, everything that happens in Russia seems to be about preserving Putin in power. And I don't think either system is ultimately sustainable. Now, we're talking a long game here, and a lot of serious damage can be done to the people of those countries as well as to the wider world as a result of their authoritarian systems and structures and efforts to spread authoritarianism beyond their borders. But we are certainly facing a challenge in the Western world, so to speak, and certainly in the United States with the fragility of our own institutions and whether they will prove robust enough to withstand the buffeting that they're now receiving. I think it will not be too long, if you think in the span of history and time, before systems that are like Russia's and China's inherently authoritarian face unsustainable pressures as well.
I just want to piggyback very quickly on that, and this echoes back to something else that Susan had said. The founders, when they were thinking through how are we going to structure the American government, the fundamental question was, what is human nature? We have to design a government that accords to what human nature is like, and I think that they did. And I think that the way that this republic, this democracy, and democracies in general, are most closely aligned to fundamental human realities and most aligned to what leads to human flourishing. This is why I think in the long term, echoing what Susan said earlier, I think the future is right. That doesn't mean that you don't go through these waves. Democracy, if you read the history of democracies, really from the founding of America on, what you see is that there are waves forward and then there are waves back. They go and then they recede. It's back and forth and back and forth. But the trajectory has been good. And again, for the sake of perspective, I remember this, and you all may as well, but there was a book that was very fashionable in the early 1980s by a French intellectual, Jean-Francois Prevail, called Why Democracies Perish. And this was a critique which you hear periodically, and the critique went basically like this. Democracy is messy, it's untidy, it's not efficient. How does democracy prevail against the iron discipline of totalitarian regimes? So that book was written in 1981, and it was 8 years later, in the midst of this sort of very dark critique, which was quite fashionable at the time, that the Soviet Union collapsed, and you had democracy spread throughout the Eastern Europe. So these things come and go, and what you have to do is, as you face these challenges in real time, you have to correct them. You have to refine them, you have to face the challenges, you have to improve it, but the trajectory is, I think, in our favor. I think the wind is at our back, because I think the critique of what leads to human dignity and human flourishing is correct.
Well, and I think the question also has embedded in it an idea that's prevalent across the U.S., that democracy here is strong, and I'll say what I mean by that in a second, and in other places it's fragile. When in fact, we have to realize that democracy isn't inevitable. It's something that's really quite wonderful that's embedded in a constitutional republic. It is because it requires us, in the ways that you all have described, that to be strong and to engage and to be present and to participate. And I love the story, whether true or not, we don't know, about Ben Franklin coming out of the Constitutional Convention, encountering this woman, what have you given us, you know, a monarchy or a democracy? And he's like, it's a republic, madam, if you can keep it, if you can keep it. And that requires our vigilance every single day to be able to do so. So I am getting the hook, the digital hook. And we could go.
Digital's better than the literal.
Yeah, exactly. We could keep talking until they drag us off. But I would want to thank you all and ask the audience to help me in thanking this wonderful panel for being with us this morning.